Inside Alabama's most brutal death row, the first thing you notice isn't the razor wire or the concrete walls. It's the silence. According to multiple news reports and court filings, Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, has carried out more executions than any other prison in the state. And yet, on most days, it sits in an uneasy quiet, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. One former corrections official, quoted in investigative reporting, described it this way: "Nothing inside Holman ever really sleeps. It just waits." That contradiction is where this story begins. Holman is home to Alabama's death row for men. According to public records from the Alabama Department of Corrections, it is the final stop for individuals convicted of capital crimes, many of whom have spent decades inside the system. It is also the site of Alabama's execution chamber, a fact confirmed repeatedly in state documents, court proceedings, and national media coverage. For years, Holman has been at the center of lawsuits, federal investigations, and intense public scrutiny, not just for executions, but for the conditions surrounding them. This is not a story about a single crime. It is a story about a place where the justice system's most irreversible decisions are carried out, and where time moves differently than anywhere else. According to state records, Holman Correctional Facility opened in 1981. From the beginning, it was designed to house some of Alabama's most high-security inmates. Over time, it became synonymous with death row itself. In court filings, attorneys have described Holman as overcrowded, understaffed, and chronically under-resourced. Former inmates and officers, speaking in news interviews and sworn testimony, have described an environment defined by tension, unpredictability, and decay. The men housed on death row at Holman live under sentences that are meant to be final. According to Alabama law, death row inmates are confined separately from the general population, typically in single cells, with highly restricted movement. Public records show that many spend 23 hours a day inside their cells. Some have been there for 10, 20, even 30 years. That kind of confinement leaves marks. According to psychological studies cited in death penalty litigation, prolonged isolation can cause anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. In legal challenges filed against the state, attorneys have argued that conditions on Alabama's death row amount to cruel and unusual punishment. State officials have consistently denied those claims, arguing that conditions meet constitutional standards. Both things can be true at once. Inside Holman, routine is everything. Lights on, count, meals through a slot in the door, recreation, when permitted, in small, enclosed areas. According to accounts published by journalists who have toured parts of the facility, the air is heavy, the paint chipped, the infrastructure visibly aging. Pipes leak, locks jam, equipment fails. These details appear again and again in inspection reports and federal filings. But the real weight of Holman isn't physical. It's psychological. Men on death row know exactly where they are. They know what this place exists to do. According to interviews with former death row inmates published in national outlets, that knowledge never fades. It hums in the background of every day. You can ignore it for moments at a time, they say, but you can never escape it. For some, that pressure turns inward. For others, it hardens into something else. Holman has also been linked to repeated incidents of violence and unrest. According to Department of Justice findings released in recent years, Alabama's prison system has experienced high rates of violence, driven in part by overcrowding, understaffing, and gang activity. While death row itself is more controlled, the broader facility has seen riots, stabbings, and assaults documented in news reports and federal investigations. One of the most significant incidents occurred in 2016 when a large-scale disturbance broke out at Holman. According to official reports and media coverage, inmates set fires, damaged property, and took control of parts of the facility for hours. No executions were taking place that day, but the incident underscored how fragile control inside the prison could become. That riot did not come out of nowhere. Court filings and investigative reporting leading up to the event had already warned of dangerous staffing shortages. Officers working double and triple shifts, posts left unmanned. According to sworn testimony from correctional staff, some units operated with far fewer officers than policy required. In that environment, tension builds quietly until it doesn't. Death row, though physically separate, does not exist in a vacuum. The men there hear the alarms. They smell the smoke. They know when something is wrong. And then there are the executions themselves. Holman is the site where Alabama carries out capital punishment. Over the years, the state has used multiple execution methods, including electrocution, lethal injection, and more recently, nitrogen hypoxia, a method that has drawn intense legal and ethical debate. According to court records and national news coverage, Alabama has faced repeated challenges over its execution protocols, with attorneys arguing that past executions were botched or caused unnecessary suffering. In some cases, executions were halted at the last minute by court orders. In others, they went forward amid protests outside the prison gates and appeals still pending in higher courts. Each execution adds another layer to Holman's legacy, another entry in public records, another chapter in a national debate that has never been resolved. For the men waiting on death row, time becomes elastic. According to public defender accounts and interviews with former inmates, days blur together. Years pass marked only by legal filings, appeals denied, or occasional visits. Some men cling to hope through the appeals process. Others reach a point where hope becomes too heavy to carry. Suicide attempts on death row have been documented in Alabama court filings and oversight reports. Each one raises questions about mental health care, monitoring, and responsibility. State officials maintain that services are available. Advocates argue they are insufficient. Again, both claims appear in the record. Holman's reputation extends far beyond Alabama. National media outlets routinely cite it when discussing the death penalty, prison violence, and systemic failure. Federal investigators have described Alabama's prisons, including Holman, as operating in a state of crisis. Lawsuits remain ongoing. Reforms are promised. Timelines shift. And still, Holman remains. This first chapter is not about judgment. It is about understanding the environment where judgment becomes final. It is about the architecture of punishment, the human beings inside it, and the system that built it. Because before we talk about individual cases, individual crimes, or individual executions, we have to understand the place itself. A place where silence carries meaning, where waiting is a way of life, where every locked door leads closer to an ending that cannot be undone, past the perimeter, past the official statements, into the daily reality of death row, where survival is measured not in years, but in hours, and where the line between order and collapse has been tested again and again by documented events the public rarely sees. The first rule everyone learns at Holman is simple: don't ask questions you don't want answered. According to court filings and investigative reporting, death row at Holman Correctional Facility operates under a rigid routine that is designed to control movement, minimize interaction, and reduce risk. On paper, it looks orderly. In reality, it feels suffocating. Men wake up before dawn to the sound of keys and boots moving down concrete tiers. The lights flick on whether you slept or not. Count happens the same way every day. Officers pausing at each cell door, eyes scanning faces they may have seen for decades. For men on death row, routine is both a shield and a weapon. It keeps chaos at bay, but it also grinds time into something shapeless. According to interviews published by national media outlets, former death row inmates have described days that feel endless and years that disappear without warning. One man told a reporter, "You don't count time by calendars. You count it by appeals denied." The cells themselves are small. According to Alabama Department of Corrections records and legal descriptions included in lawsuits, death row cells are typically single occupancy, constructed of concrete and steel, with solid doors broken only by a narrow window and a food slot. Inside, there is little room to move. A bed fixed to the wall, a toilet sink combination, sometimes a small desk. Everything else exists in your head. That isolation is intentional. State policy argues that death row inmates must be separated for security reasons. Attorneys challenging those policies argue that prolonged isolation causes measurable psychological harm. Court documents cite medical experts who describe symptoms including paranoia, depression, panic attacks, and hallucinations. The state disputes the severity of those claims, but the effects are repeatedly documented. Inside Holman, the tension doesn't announce itself. It simmers. According to sworn testimony from correctional officers and reports from the Department of Justice, Holman has long struggled with staffing shortages. Officers working long shifts cover multiple posts. Radios fail. Backup can take minutes that feel like hours. In a prison built to contain men with nothing left to lose, those gaps matter. Death row itself is quieter than general population, but it is not immune to unrest. Men communicate through walls, through vents, through shouted conversations timed around counts. According to news interviews with former inmates, information travels faster than official announcements ever could. If someone receives bad news from a lawyer, everyone knows. If an execution date is set, the tier feels it immediately. One former inmate described it as the air changing. When the state schedules an execution, death row tightens. According to public records, executions at Holman have often been preceded by increased security measures. Movement is restricted. Extra officers are brought in. Legal teams work around the clock, filing last-minute appeals. Families wait outside the gates. Protesters gather. Media vans line the road. Inside, the man facing execution waits. According to court filings, some inmates choose to speak with spiritual advisors. Others withdraw completely. Some request final meals, though those requests have become more limited over time. Each execution follows a protocol outlined in state documents, but no two experiences are the same. There have been executions that went smoothly, at least according to official statements. And there have been executions that did not. Multiple lawsuits filed against the state of Alabama detail executions where 4 lines were difficult to place, where procedures took longer than expected, where witnesses described visible distress. In several cases, courts temporarily halted executions after these reports surfaced. Each incident added to Holman's reputation as a place where the system itself seemed strained to its limits. But executions are only part of the story. Holman has also been shaped by what happens when control slips. The 2016 riot remains one of the most cited examples. According to official reports and media coverage, inmates set fires, damaged property, and overwhelmed staff. Correctional officers were forced to retreat from parts of the facility. It took hours to regain control. No hostages were taken, but the message was clear: the system was fragile. Investigations that followed pointed to the same issues that had been raised for years. Severe understaffing, aging infrastructure, overcrowding, a culture of reaction instead of prevention. Death row inmates watched it unfold from behind locked doors. According to interviews conducted later, some described hearing alarms echo for hours. Others smelled smoke drifting through the tiers. Everyone understood what it meant. If the prison could lose control like that once, it could happen again. Holman's death row is not just a place of punishment. It is a pressure chamber. Men arrive there after years in county jails, trial courts, and other prisons. By the time they reach Holman, their cases are often national news. Appeals continue, but the margin for hope narrows. According to public defender reports, Alabama has one of the longest death row wait times in the country. Some men have waited decades. That waiting becomes its own sentence. According to interviews with mental health professionals cited in court documents, the uncertainty is often worse than the finality. Not knowing when or if an execution will happen. Watching others leave the tier and never return. Hearing the sounds of preparation on execution days. It creates a constant state of alert. Some men break under that pressure. Suicide attempts on Alabama's death row have been documented in legal filings and investigative reporting. Each incident raises questions about monitoring, mental health treatment, and responsibility. State officials say protocols are in place. Advocates argue they fail too often. Holman's officers are caught in the middle. According to testimony from corrections staff, working death row is unlike any other assignment. Officers know the men by name. They know their cases. They escort them to showers, recreation, legal calls. Some officers say they maintain professional distance. Others admit that distance becomes impossible over time. One former officer, quoted anonymously in a news investigation, said, "You're walking men to their deaths. You can't pretend that doesn't follow you home." That emotional toll is rarely discussed publicly, but it appears repeatedly in internal reports and interviews. As the years passed, Holman became a symbol in the national debate over capital punishment. Advocacy groups cited it as evidence of systemic failure. State officials defended it as a necessary institution enforcing the law. Court rulings went back and forth. Executions resumed, then paused, then resumed again. Each cycle left scars. This chapter is not about arguing for or against the death penalty. It is about documenting what happens when a system designed for finality collides with human endurance. Holman is where that collision plays out in real time, every day. Men wake up knowing exactly where they are. Officers report for duty knowing exactly what their jobs might require. Lawyers file motions knowing the clock never stops. And outside the walls, the public debates justice in abstract terms. Inside Holman, justice is concrete, steel, and silence. That silence will break. Because Holman's history shows a clear pattern, documented again and again in public records. Pressure builds, warnings are ignored, and eventually, something gives. The question is never if. It's when. By the time the public hears about what happens at Holman, the damage is usually already done. That pattern appears again and again in court filings, investigative journalism, and federal oversight reports. Problems build quietly, buried in internal memos and understaffed shift logs, until a single moment forces them into the open. At Holman Correctional Facility, those moments have defined its legacy. According to Department of Justice findings released in recent years, Alabama's prison system, including Holman, showed systemic deficiencies that created an unreasonable risk of serious harm. The language was clinical, but the meaning was not. It meant that violence, neglect, and failure were not isolated incidents. They were structural. Holman sat at the center of that conclusion. After the 2016 riot, state officials promised reform. According to public statements and legislative hearings, plans were announced to improve staffing, modernize facilities, and increase oversight. Yet year after year, follow-up reports showed little measurable change. Vacancies remained high. Overtime became routine. Officers burned out faster than replacements could be trained. Court filings from inmates and civil rights organizations describe conditions that remained largely unchanged. Broken locks, delayed medical responses, long stretches where inmates were confined to their cells due to staffing shortages. Each complaint added another layer to Holman's record. Executions continued in fits and starts. When Alabama resumed executions after legal pauses, Holman once again became the focal point of national attention. According to court documents, several executions were delayed or halted mid-procedure due to difficulty establishing intravenous lines. In one widely reported case, witnesses described an execution that lasted hours before being called off. The state later acknowledged procedural failures. Those incidents triggered lawsuits, investigations, and temporary moratoriums. Each time, the same questions surfaced. Was the protocol flawed? Were staff adequately trained? Could the system reliably carry out its own sentences? Holman did not offer easy answers. For the men on death row, the fallout was immediate. According to interviews cited in legal challenges, executions that failed or were delayed intensified fear across the tier. Men described listening to hours of preparation, then silence, then uncertainty. Some believed they would be next. Others believed the system itself was breaking down. Mental health professionals referenced in court testimony warned that these events compounded already extreme psychological stress. The state disputed those claims, but records show an increase in emergency mental health interventions following execution attempts. Outside the prison, pressure mounted. Civil rights groups used Holman as evidence in broader challenges to Alabama's correctional system. Families of correctional officers spoke publicly about unsafe working conditions. Former staff testified before lawmakers about understaffing and fear on the job. Media investigations amplified those voices. Holman became shorthand for failure. According to legislative records, funding debates grew increasingly tense. Some lawmakers argued that the prison was beyond repair. Others insisted it could be fixed with the right resources. Meanwhile, new prisons were proposed, delayed, redesigned, and debated again. Holman remained open. Its legacy, however, had already been sealed. In academic studies, Holman is cited as an example of how capital punishment systems strain institutional capacity. In federal reports, it appears as a warning about understaffing and neglect. In legal textbooks, it is referenced in cases examining cruel and unusual punishment. In public memory, it is remembered as Alabama's execution chamber. For the men who passed through its death row, legacy means something simpler. Years spent waiting. Appeals denied. Appeals granted. Friends escorted away. Names removed from the count list. Silence filling the gaps. For correctional officers, legacy looks like early retirement, chronic stress, and memories that do not fade easily. According to interviews with former staff, some leave corrections entirely after working death row. Others stay, believing someone has to. Holman did not collapse in a single catastrophe. It eroded. That erosion is what makes it important. Not because it is unique, but because it is representative. Public records show that many prisons across the United States share the same warning signs: understaffing, aging infrastructure, mental health crises, and policies stretched beyond their limits. Holman simply reached those limits first, and in the most visible way. Today, debates about the future of capital punishment often return to the same place. Can a system designed decades ago meet modern legal, ethical, and medical standards? Can executions be carried out without error? Can prisons operate safely when resources fall short? There are no clean conclusions. Holman still stands. Its walls still hold men waiting on appeals. Officers still report for duty. Lawyers still file motions. The machinery continues to turn, slower now, watched more closely, but unchanged at its core. The final fallout of Holman is not a single verdict or reform. It is a record, one written in court filings, investigative reports, and human testimony. A record that shows what happens when punishment, politics, and human endurance collide over decades. And that is Holman's true legacy, not just as Alabama's death row, but as a reminder that systems do not fail all at once. They fail slowly, quietly, and repeatedly, until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore.